Hello, my name's Louise Langridge and I'm the Joint Managing Director of Morgan McKinley Australia. I would like to welcome you to our Insight series. As part of our commitment to add value to each of our specialist communities, we're delighted to bring to you this series where you will hear from market leaders in your industry. Hi Juliet, welcome to the Morgan McKinley Insight series. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about some of your insights on the diversity challenge that we're facing in Australia. So Juliet, to start, why would you think this is so important for organisations to get right?
There are probably four main reasons for attention to diversity in Australia's current market. The first is just ticket to play, so making sure that you're compliant with regulations so that you can participate in the market. So for example, the Australian Stock Exchange requires every organisation to have a diversity policy, to set measurable objectives. You just have to do those things if you want to be in the game. The second is around employees, so thinking about the attraction of employees, the retention of those employees, and how their contribution is maximised within the organisation. So getting the best out of your people. Those are the traditional ways that diversity is thought about, or at least the value of diversity is thought about. And there are two more. One is around customers and thinking about how you connect with your customers, the products that you sell to your customers, the market share that you have. That is a little bit undercooked. We tend to think of it in very simplistic ways that, you know, we're going to open up a branch, it's going to be in Chinatown, therefore we have to have people who look Asian. And that's a very simplistic way of doing it. There's probably a lot more that we could get out of it. And the last way of thinking about the value of diversity is diversity of thinking. So thinking in a much more sophisticated way about problem solving and innovation, the very way that you make decisions about business. And that is the sort of nirvana of the value of diversity to an organisation.
So in your experience, what are you seeing as leadership and best practice in this area?
The best that I'm seeing at the moment is exemplified by the Male Champions of Change. They are a group of 21 CEOs or leaders of government, or more broadly the executive, coming together. And they've been coming together since about 2010 to 2011, every quarter, same people, no substitutes, and talking about the topic, staying engaged with it, and therefore, because they're people of action, driving systemic changes in their business. Now, not perfect, but that's the best, because that sustained conversation has meant that they have really explored the issue and started to shift the needle as a group. And their footprint, these are 21 of the largest organisations in Australia, their economic footprint, their employee footprint has started to change the conversation. And what that has meant is that those people who were on the sidelines, not really interested in diversity at all, have started to prick up their ears and listen to what these leaders are saying. So not only has it had a direct impact on their organisations and the suppliers to those organisations, but the people who are on sidebar are noticing it as well.
If you're going to pick one thing that the Male Champions have delivered so far that you think has really helped move the dial, what would that be?
I think for me, one of the primary values out of the Male Champions of Change has been this creation of a document called the Leadership Shadow. And the Leadership Shadow is basically helping leaders to understand how they are perceived in terms of what they say and what they do, what they prioritise, time and money, and how they measure diversity, and to give them a framework to evaluate themselves. Let me just draw into it a little bit. If you think about what you say, leaders say, well, I talk about diversity all the time. People know that I'm committed to it. And yet, if you ask followers, what do they hear? Generally, they will say, silence. I hear nothing. Or if I hear anything, I hear gender. And so this tool enables people to evaluate themselves. Why is it that you think you're saying one thing and someone else is hearing another? The answer to that one is actually relativities. It's how much you talk about a topic. If you talk about the market all of the time and you talk about diversity infrequently, this message won't be heard. So what do you do? How do you demonstrate your commitment? And I think the interesting one around priorities, followers look at leaders and intuitively know what's important to them. And what's important is indicated by where you spend your time and money. So Alan Joyce, for example, he decided to do a diary audit for 6 weeks and look at where he spent his time. If diversity and inclusion is important to him, is it demonstrated in how much time he is spending on people issues? In his case, he found it was, but that's an interesting thing for leaders to do. So the value for Male Champions of Change is putting out there a framework by which people can judge themselves.
Are there any industries, sectors or geographies that you would say are actually leading the curve in this area?
So there is an interesting thing at the moment in Australia that in terms of industry, attention to diversity is of a broad spectrum. Previously it wasn't so. Previously you could see that those organisations that were more female dominated had more of an interest in diversity, and particularly that was like a domino effect. So Westpac years ago having a keen interest in it, and then the other banks kind of falling over some time ago. Law the same, but now it's quite different, and you can see it across a broad array of organisations. BHP Billiton, for example, not female dominated and yet very interested in diversity more broadly than gender. And I think what is creating the change now is it's actually the leaders of these organisations seeing value in it, and so therefore it is industry agnostic. But that creates a momentum. In terms of geography, what I think is interesting here is that, and Deloitte just recently did a study of 21 countries, for example, and its diversity is resonant in each of those countries in slightly different ways. In the US, it's very resonant around race. In the UK, it's much more resonant around class and race. In Australia, it's resonant around gender diversity. In Singapore, more around disability and religion. So each country has a slightly different framework. Therefore, how do you judge that one is doing it better than the other? It's the apples and oranges in comparison. But what I do think about the story in Australia that is potentially different to the story that I hear when I go to other countries and talk about it is this level of this collective C-suite group in Australia being interested. Whereas when you go to other countries, it's potentially the board, potentially just around gender wherever you are, or it's in these, like previously, pockets of industry. So I think we've got a broad wave, and I also think because we're a country that is very ethnically diverse, it also has a different undercurrent in relation to gender and ethnicity.
What factors do you think are important that candidates are looking for when they're considering joining a new organisation?
Inclusion is important to everyone. So it's not so much saying look out for language around diversity. What you potentially want to look out for is this an organisation where I can be myself and where myself will be valued? Is this an organisation which appreciates that all of us are slightly different? Or when you look at the top of the organisation, do you get the feeling that everyone has become the same? So you want the freedom to grow and the freedom to be valued as an individual. Now that sounds very conceptual. How do you do that? But I think one way of looking up is looking at that diversity of people in terms of their backgrounds, in terms of the way they express themselves, in terms of visible aspects of diversity, in terms of do they come from different industries. And I think in terms of inclusion, it is speaking to people about their experiences, asking them questions like, do you feel really valued here? Do you have a sense of belonging? Do you feel that your uniqueness is known to other people? And critically, do you feel like you have a voice in decision making? So I think you have to do a bit of homework, but it is around inclusion and then looking up, is there a range of people in the organisation? And I could be one of them.
What advice would you give organisations that are looking to attract and retain the best talent in this area?
So to first and foremost engage with the topic. That is, consider diversity and inclusion in terms of the messaging, in terms of the candidates that you want to attract, and then when you're in the moment with the candidate talking about it. Not assuming that that's only of interest to a very small segment of employees. Inclusion is relevant to everyone. But I think there's another point around it too, and that is who you look for. So you may say, I'm interested in diversity and inclusion, and someone walks into the room and they're just not who you were expecting, and your jaw drops and it's quite evident. The challenge, of course, is that we all look for people who are very similar to ourselves, and we all want to make decisions which are risk averse. So although we say we want this, we actually select this. And I think there's a moment here for organisations to be a bit more courageous. If organisations want diversity of thinking, the top end value that is created through attention to diversity, it's not going to come through recruiting candidates who are exactly like the previous candidate and the candidate before that.
What are some of the practices you've observed in organisations that have effectively developed a culture that attracts and retains the best talent?
So there are two things that spring to mind for me, and maybe a third in relation to Australia. So let me pick those off. The first is that organisations really need to engage their leaders in the conversation of change. And there's a piece of work that we did at Deloitte in which we had an intervention around leaders, helping them to shift their mindset and then their behaviours in relation to diversity and inclusion, to become more inclusive. And we went back and surveyed them. How do you think you've gone? Do you think you are more accountable? Do you behave more respectfully? Do you value diverse opinions? And the response rate was something 94% said yes. But what's interesting in that is that then we went and spoke to the team members who had no knowledge of what the leaders had gone through. And 3/4 of them said, my leader's different. My leader is more respectful. Our team is more collaborative. We have a more inclusive workplace. So that gives me comfort in the first point, which is that to get a change in the outcome, the retention of talented people, you have to start with leaders. The second point is around the system itself, the employee life cycle. And where is it in the employee life cycle that has a magnified impact on the loss of talent? And there are probably moments in that, but a key moment is when talent is assessed, the performance review moment, and looking at those people who are categorised as having potential versus those people who are categorised as having performed. Now, performance is very metric driven, has some stuff attached to it, but generally numbers based. But the potential is very discretionary, and in that moment you start to lose your talent, because there are some people who are seen as having potential and some who are not, and generally the people who are the people who are normative, the people who are always seen as having potential. And so those people who are different will lose out, and difference being someone who works flexibly, someone who's a woman in a male-dominated industry and vice versa, someone with an ethnicity and a white culture. The third thing, and this is the interesting thing about Australia, is that we lose talent because we don't address work-life balance well. And it seems to have a disparate impact on high potential employees, because high potential employees have choices. And if it's not working for them, they'll go. And we are still in a paradigm of saying to people, fit into our culture, this is how we work. We tend to do things in a very overwhelmed way. Is that okay with you? And the person who has choices says, actually no, and they set up business for themselves. And at Australia in the moment, and the predictions into the future, because the barriers to starting up your own business are so low, we'll have more people moving out of mainstream corporate Australia and more people moving into their own show. So three things: leadership and the moments that matter in the employee life cycle, and attention to work-life balance.